It was a 25,000-man firing squad against an army of 6,000 dying men. King Henry V wasn't looking for a victory, he was looking for a grave. This is how the English king turned an impossible retreat into the most ruthless tactical ambush in medieval history. The campaign had started with the capture of the port city of Harfleur, but the victory was a disaster. Sickness, the bloody flux, cost Henry V 2/3 of his entire invasion force. Now, with maybe 6,000 men left, weak, sick, and starving, the English began a desperate 150-mile race to the English-held coast. The French had no need to fight them. They commanded overwhelming numbers and could simply wait for the disease and starvation to consume the invaders. The French High Command, convinced the English were running, allowed them to march north, viewing Henry's force as a prize to be cornered and captured rather than a threat to be fought. It was a staggering tactical blunder born of pure arrogance. The English retreat itself became a march of the dead. Thousands of men, sick, starving, and clad in sodden leather and mail, trudged across the sodden landscape. Every league north was a testament to the iron will of King Henry, who marched alongside his men, sharing their misery. The path to the coast required crossing the river Somme. Henry's scouts found the traditional fords heavily guarded or destroyed. For days, the English army was forced to march south along the river, desperately seeking a way across, while the main French army paralleled their movements on the opposite bank. It was a race against time, and the French were winning. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm the ranks, Henry's scouts found an obscure, lightly guarded ford near a small village. Under the cover of darkness and a fog, the king led his entire army across, narrowly escaping a French force sent to cut them off. The French commanders were furious at missing their chance to trap the English against the river. They now committed to battle, their massive host wheeling around to cut off the English path to the coast once and for all. The king was safe, but his gambit had failed. He had crossed the river only to find the entire French host, 25,000 men, now directly in his path. The running was over. The field of Agincourt waited. By the evening of October 24th, the English army had found their way blocked near a tiny village called Agincourt. The French had assembled an enormous force, estimates of which range from 20,000 up to 30,000 men, dwarfing the exhausted English corps of maybe 6,000 to 9,000. There was no escape left. Henry had gambled on retreat, and now he had to gamble on battle. He rode through his lines, inspecting his men, who were beyond exhaustion, clad in mud and driven only by the sheer force of his will. The field was set for slaughter. The sheer imbalance of power, a small, sick, retreating army against the flower of French knighthood, made any prospect of victory a fantasy. Yet, Henry and his men knew that to stand and fight was their only path to survival. The two armies faced each other across a recently ploughed field, and as the endless, soaking rain began to fall once more, the English knew their next day would be their last. The field was silent, broken only by the distant, disorganized clamor of the French camp's revelry. All night, the noise carried across the muddy fields, the sound of singing, the slosh of wine, the arrogant laughter of knights, and the constant clang of blacksmiths fixing armor for the next morning's inevitable victory. The French were so confident that their commanders debated not if they would win, but who would have the honor of capturing King Henry V. This supreme arrogance was a disease in its own right, blinding the massive army to the realities of the ground and the opponent. Across the fields, the quiet of the English camp was broken by the sound of prayers and confessions. Men knew they were sick and outnumbered, and that the dawn would likely bring their end. They were huddled in the freezing dark, many suffering from the dysentery that weakened them with every hour. The English had no campfires, no celebratory wine, only the cold, hard mud beneath them and the daunting sight of the immense French host arrayed before them. King Henry V was the exception to the rule of misery. He spent the night moving quietly through the lines, sharing the last of his wine with his knights and speaking to his soldiers. He did not promise victory, he promised honor. He fostered the spirit that this was a band of brothers, united against an overwhelming tide, and that only those who were present would share in the eternal glory of the fight. Henry V's genius lay not just in his tactics but in his psychology. It transformed desperation into defiance. He told his men that their ransom was too small to worry about, but that the French ransom for him would be enormous, a detail that injected a necessary dark humor into their terror. Henry knew he couldn't beat them with courage. He had to beat them with mud and geometry. The key to the English plan was the geography of the field. The battlefield of Agincourt was not an open plain. It was a narrow, constricted corridor of open ground hemmed in by two dense areas of woodland. This narrow choke point, roughly 1,000 yards across, was Henry V's only advantage. It meant that the massive French army, which outnumbered the English perhaps 3-1, could not deploy its full width. Their tremendous numbers would be funneled into a relatively small area. Critically, the field was composed of recently ploughed farmland that had been saturated by days of torrential rain. The ground was not firm earth. It was a deep, clinging, thick layer of mud. This detail, often overlooked, would prove to be the most lethal component of the day. For the heavy French cavalry, their great protective armor was not a shield, but a slow metal anchor waiting to drown them in the mire. The English longbowmen were the core of the force. Henry V had about 5,000 archers left, and they spent the night preparing their secret weapon, the sharpened wooden stakes, or piles. These were 6-foot long, thick wooden poles pointed at both ends, which they hammered into the ground and angled toward the enemy. These piles would form an improvised, lethal hedge against a cavalry charge, the archer's shield. They offered the archers a measure of safety that no infantry had ever enjoyed before. By morning, the English formation was set. Men-at-arms in the center, archers on the flanks, all nestled between the two great, silent woods. They were few, they were sick, but they were ready to die on their feet. Across the field, the massive French army was a spectacle of modern military power, a glittering wall of expensive plate armor and colorful banners. So numerous they had difficulty even assembling in the bottleneck Henry V had chosen. The stage was set, not for a battle, but for an execution, one that would defy all military logic. The sun rose, but the French command, still supremely confident, would not move. Their plan was simple. The English were starved, sick, and running. The French would wait for the English to break formation, or to be driven by hunger and desperation, to try and retreat again. The French wanted the English to attack their defensive position first, a move that would be suicidal for Henry's small force. For 3 long, agonizing hours, the armies faced each other, separated by several hundred yards of deep, sodden mud. The silence was immense, heavy with the weight of 25,000 Frenchmen waiting for their prey to make a mistake. It was in this moment of stalled warfare that King Henry V made his most audacious move, the stroke of tactical genius that defined the day. At approximately 11 in the morning, Henry gave the order to advance. This was not a charge, but a slow, deliberate march forward of the entire English line. It was a move of immense risk. Henry was deliberately breaking his defensive position, but he was doing it for a purpose: to lure the French into the trap. He ordered his men to advance to the point where the French vanguard was just within longbow range, a distance of roughly 250 yards. Once the line reached this spot, the archers would swiftly hammer their sharpened stakes into the ground, creating their defensive palisade. The French, seeing the small English force advancing and stopping to hammer posts into the ground, interpreted it not as a tactical maneuver but as a sign of weakness, or perhaps even an admission of Henry's own impatience. The king knew the proud, arrogant, and impatient nature of the French nobility. They saw their prey moving, their moment of glory presented, and their disciplined resolve snapped. The order was given by the French commanders to launch the first wave, the massive, dense vanguard of armored men-at-arms and heavy cavalry. The genius of the English formation lay in the archers, hidden on the flanks. The archers, commanded to fire not just at the French ranks, but at the gaps between them, ensured a devastating crossfire into the bottleneck. Furthermore, they had been ordered to aim at the French horses. An unhorsed knight was merely a heavy man stuck in the mud. A downed horse created instant chaos, turning a charge into a pile-up. The entire, disciplined English formation, anchored by the archers' deadly, angled crossfire, was the mastermind of Henry V. This was the moment the English army, sick and few, took control of the battle. The French, committed to the charge, could not turn back. The French army, viewing the English from across the fields, saw only a prize of war, and they moved as one toward the narrow funnel. If you're captivated by these incredible moments in military history and want to see more stories that challenge conventional wisdom, please consider subscribing to the channel right now. Your support helps us bring more of history's greatest upsets to life. The first French trumpet sounded, immediately followed by the drumming thunder of thousands of armored horses beginning their charge. This sound was intended to intimidate and break the will of the English. It was immediately and violently overwhelmed by the organized, hellish sound of 6,000 longbows firing in unison. The initial volley turned the narrow corridor of sky dark with a relentless rain of death. The arrow storm was not like anything the French had ever faced. These were not the inaccurate, short-range darts of a skirmish. The English longbow was a weapon of incredible power, capable of penetrating plate armor at close range, but at this distance, its true effectiveness was the sheer volume of fire. The arrows struck the horses, the flanks, and the unprotected visors of the French knights. The horses, maddened by the pain and the noise, reared, collapsed, and spun, immediately creating gaps and chaos in the front rank. But the true agent of carnage was the mud. The recently plowed earth had been turned into a thick, clinging morass by days of rain. The initial cavalry charge failed to gain momentum. The horses, already panicked by the arrows, could not find purchase in the deep soil. They struggled, exhausted, and eventually collapsed, throwing their heavily armored riders into the mire. The first rank of French men-at-arms, clad in hundreds of pounds of steel, entered the field only to find that their great advantage, their magnificent, protective armor, had become a lethal anchor. A knight who slipped and fell in the mud could not easily rise. His armor, which was meant to deflect a sword blow, now held him trapped, sinking into the earth. The problem was exponentially compounded by the ranks following behind. The second and third lines of French knights, unable to see the disaster unfolding in the arrow-swept bottleneck, were pushed forward by the irresistible momentum of the dense army behind them. They walked straight into the disaster. The French vanguard was compressed into a solid, immobile wall of steel. It was no longer a charge, it was a catastrophic pile-up. French knights were pushed against each other, immobilized by the mud and the sheer press of bodies, suffocating inside their own expensive armor. Their swords, shields, and battle axes became useless, as they lacked the space to even lift them effectively. It was the physics of carnage, the weight of the armor, the pressure of the numbers, and the stickiness of the mud combined to create a scenario where the massive, professional French army could not fight, could not breathe, and could only die. The English longbowmen, having exhausted their arrows, dropped their bows and seized the hatchets, mauls, and short swords they carried. These archers, light on their feet and unburdened by heavy plate, were terrifyingly mobile and efficient. They swarmed the flanks of the helpless, immobilized French mass, using the gaps between the trees and the terrain to avoid the main press. They moved quickly among the trapped and fallen Frenchmen, seeking the gaps in the armor, dispatching the flower of French knighthood with brutal effectiveness. The English men-at-arms, standing on relatively firmer ground behind the palisade, now faced not a coordinated charge, but a demoralized, suffocating wall of exhausted targets. The battle was transformed from an assault into a slaughter, a military upset born entirely from Henry V's tactical foresight and the overwhelming power of the longbow. The fighting at the front became a desperate, close-quarters slaughter in the mud. The English men-at-arms and the light-footed archers pushed into the trapped French vanguard. The sound was no longer the ringing of steel, but the sickening thud of mallets and the frantic, muffled cries of men suffocating inside their own armor. The mud was stained red, mixed with blood and gore, a churned graveyard for the proudest nobility of France. After hours of ferocious fighting, the first line of the French vanguard was broken, shattered, and routed. Yet, the battle was not over. The second wave of the French army, commanded by the Duke of Alençon, finally entered the fray. This wave was fresher, better organized, and mounted a ferocious counterattack that briefly managed to breach the English line and reached King Henry V himself. The king, fighting alongside his brother, was struck by an axe that shattered the crown on his helmet. He fought with the ferocity of a man defending his own life and the life of his kingdom. It was in this close combat that the true strength of the English resolve showed itself. They held, they pushed back, and the second wave was eventually crushed and repelled, suffering casualties nearly as catastrophic as the first. The Duke of Alençon himself was killed near the king, but then came the moment of profound military necessity that would forever stain the English victory. A small, opportunistic French force, led by a local French lord, launched a diversionary raid on the lightly guarded English baggage train near the rear of the field. The raid itself was militarily insignificant. They stole some valuables and perhaps captured some food, but when the news reached Henry V, he saw it as an existential threat. The French still had massive, uncommitted reserves. Henry's exhausted army was in the midst of a battle, struggling to hold its ground against the last of the Second French Line. If the French reserves thought the English were distracted or vulnerable, they might launch a final, organized charge. King Henry V looked at the thousands of French prisoners his men had taken prisoners who were now demoralized, but still potentially dangerous, outnumbering his fighting force. He could not spare the men to guard them, and he could not risk the prisoners rearming themselves and attacking the English from the rear during a final French counterattack. In one of the most brutal orders of the Middle Ages, Henry V commanded the execution of the thousands of French prisoners. The king's decision was controversial, but it was an act of cold, pragmatic military necessity. He chose the survival of his army over the chivalric tradition of ransom. The sight of their own countrymen being slaughtered by the English broke the final will of the French reserves. Seeing the absolute ruthlessness of the English, the remaining French forces turned and fled the field in a final, panicked rout. The battle was won. The English forces, exhausted but ecstatic, stood victorious on a field littered with the dead. The casualty ratio was impossible, a testament to tactical genius and the devastating power of the longbow. While the English lost a few hundred men, the French losses were staggering, likely between 5,000 and 6,000, including half of the great nobility of France. The victory at Agincourt immediately changed the geopolitical landscape. Within a few years, it would lead to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, making Henry V the heir to the French throne. The legacy of the battle was the eternal symbol of the English longbowman as the most feared soldier in Europe, a hero born not of noble blood, but of courage and skill, forever changing the nature of warfare itself. The story of Agincourt proves that a desperate, well-led few can indeed defeat the overconfident many. If you want more deep dives into the strategies and figures that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next, and if you know someone who loves these incredible tales of unlikely victory, hit that share button.